Now we're going to talk a little bit about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, formerly known as battle fatigue, shell shock, traumatic brain injury, otherwise known as TBI. And why is it such a big deal? Why do we keep hearing about it over the past several years of these conflicts that we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq? And frankly, it's because there's been such a push to protect the service member in the combat zone. They have enhanced technology to the point where, believe it or not, it's a lot harder to kill us than you think, whether through a bullet or through an explosive blast. And I'm not minimizing the fact of that. I've felt the force of an explosion myself, and I'm sure my guest that's going to be joining me here soon has as well. The point being, though, is that the entire Department of Defense has developed a doctrine since Vietnam to fix what they call the magic hour. So when you are wounded in the combat zone, their goal is to get you to a primary treatment facility within an hour. And if you're able to save that person within the hour, the chances of them surviving go up exponentially as a result of that. And they have training centers, most notably the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Polk, Louisiana, where they stress that medevac process to the hilt. Any unit that goes there for combat exercises, everybody gets killed, and then they have to do a massive casualty evacuation exercise where they process the whole thing and see how the system can work. And I'm living proof that it works very well. I was from point of explosion to a top-level hospital in Baghdad, over 70 miles away from where I was at, in less than an hour. To that point, the Department of Defense has been able to get that right. Now the challenge is, how do we address the less tangible issues in terms of traumatic brain injury and PTSD? These are not visible issues. Sometimes they go undiagnosed for months or even years. And so I have a lot of opinions and observations on this, and I'm not the only one that does, and I'm sure many in my audience do as well. And I invited to join us on the air today former Captain Jason Fritz, United States Army. He served with the 3rd Squadron of the 7th U.S. Cavalry of the 3rd Infantry Division, another storied Army unit in the defense posture of this nation. He commanded tanks. He has deployed to Iraq 3 times before he, I believe, separated from the service in 2008. He was part of the invasion in 2003. So as I introduce you, Captain Fritz, let's get some background on you. And you graduated from West Point, as we discussed. Tell me a little bit about that, and when you graduated.
Good morning. Yeah, I graduated from West Point in June 2002, which was the first class to graduate from West Point after the 9/11 attacks.
That's a distinction. I remember that making the news, actually, when your class graduated.
Yeah, it was a bit of a surreal experience. We had the president was our commencement speaker, and as roughly 1,000 of us were graduating that day, we're thinking about paying on our lieutenant's bars and the adventures that lay ahead in the Army. There we were, hearing the president in person laying out his preemption doctrine and essentially telling us that there was a high likelihood that we were going to be going to war with Iraq. Yeah, it was a very interesting experience.
I'm sure. And so out of the gate, you got assigned to the 3rd ID to be a platoon leader for a group of tanks. Is that correct?
Yes. Okay. I was assigned to 3rd Squadron, 7th Cavalry, and was given a tank platoon.
There we go. And for those that don't know, a platoon of tanks, unlike a platoon of infantry, which is maybe 50 guys, give or take, a platoon of tanks is 4 tanks plus their crews, and a tank has a crew capacity of 4 or 3.
That's correct.
Yeah, so you got
the tank platoon is 16 soldiers.
16 guys. So, and having said that, the tank itself, the M1A1 Abrams, a world famous force multiplier. I've seen it in action. I know you have too, and you were there as part of the invasion. So you were definitely part of the tip of the spear going into Iraq when it happened in 2003. And as tough as that machine is, that also makes it quite a target. So describe to me a little bit the experience of when you rolled over the border into Iraq and started facing combat conditions and what it was like for you and your platoon.
Right. Yeah, firstly, the Abrams tank is most likely the best tank in the world, and it's fast, it shoots straight and long, and provides more protection than anything else our Army has, and probably than anything else in the world. Some things that hit tanks, like certain types of rocket-propelled grenades, you can barely even feel them inside the tank. Sometimes you don't even realize you've been hit unless your wingman, someone, a tank next to you, says, hey, you've been hit by an RPG. The larger explosions, such as IEDs or artillery rounds, the tank, since it's just inside, it's just a big metal,
big metal
can.
That
it becomes an echo chamber for the concussion inside.
I was going to ask, when you were there during the invasion, and maybe it wasn't during the invasion, but in subsequent deployments, did any of your tanks have that active armor, that armor that would respond and explode back on an incoming projectile?
I have never seen the reactive armor on the Abrams tank. We used to use them on our Bradley fighting vehicles,
okay,
but not on the tanks. The armor on the tank is anything that's going to penetrate the tank is going to penetrate the reactive armor as well.
Right. Yeah, if it's going to penetrate the tank, it's going to be big.
Right, and you also have to worry about weight issues. An Abrams tank that's combat loaded already weighs over 70 tons,
sure,
which makes it difficult to maneuver even on roads. Never mind trails along canals.
So, as a big echo chamber, you're inside basically a resonating chamber when you're receiving fire, whether it's from a medium-sized machine gun, or even, as you indicated, you guys could withstand an RPG hit and still be functional. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah. It takes quite a bit to knock out a tank, but like I said, the guys that are inside the tank, it's a big enough hit. It's going to ring their bell pretty well, because while the impact may not penetrate into the tank, the concussion really echoes inside.
Right. Now, you guys wear headsets as part of your helmet. Does that help mitigate some of the shock factor or the noise factor?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that they're made by Bose. They're state of the art, so that you can hear the radio and the intercom over the sound of the tank and the firing. And they've moved those types of systems into Humvees,
right,
realizing that there's a lot of background noise, and the old hand mics look like a little telephone that you hooked your radios wasn't doing it. So you get the added protection against concussions if you have these headsets, and it makes it easier to communicate.
I have an interesting story. I'll tell you about it after the interview. It's not going to make it for the show, but I have an interesting story about headsets and what I almost had the night that I got wounded in Iraq. It was great, but anyway, that's a tangent. So through these varying levels of combat that you experienced, both during the invasion and thereafter, you returned home to your unit. I'm assuming this was back at Fort Stewart, Georgia. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So once the euphoria, all the coming home parties settled down, everybody is done tying one on. They got it out of their system. They report back to garrison before they head on leave for a month or so. Can you remember what it was like in what you observed, the demeanor of the men under your command? What subtle nuances you saw that changed in their demeanor one way or the other, whether it was good, bad, behavioral?
Yeah, the time after you come back from your post-deployment leave, which is, by the time that's all over, it's probably about 6 weeks after you've gotten back. That's really, as a leader, when you start running into problems. Soldiers have had time to think about what they have just been through. They may not be dealing with it well. They might be having lots of family problems as the reality of being home really sets in, and so that euphoria.
Well, let's touch on that a little bit here. Let's describe your experience. You got home. I don't know if you were married at the time, but were you married at the time when you came back, your first tour?
Yes, I was married then.
So you got home. This is I'm going to assume in 2004-ish.
2003.
2003, coming back from the invasion. You got home. Everybody's amped up to see you after the sweep through Iraq. Describe I'll call it pressure from your family when you got home, and how your family was just so happy to have you. And they just clenched into you. And what did that feel like in terms of you making your adjustment coming back from Iraq?
Yeah, it's a very disconcerting experience, because you've had this alternate reality that becomes what you think of as reality when you're in combat, and then you come home. And I came home to a wife who was very, very happy to have me home, and my parents had come down I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and then they were there as well, and it was just very, very joyous. But after a little while, my then wife had been she'd been managing on her own for a little while, and here I was, a stranger, essentially coming back into the house, and I haven't been living in buildings for quite some time, and it takes a lot of adjustment to get back into normality.
Right, and for those that wanted some kind of a bearing on that, I think of combat as absolute clarity. especially when the bullets are flying. I was light infantry, so when you're in the combat zone, believe it or not, you can see bullets when they are shot at you, coming at you and coming by you. I don't know if you had the opportunity when you stuck your head out of the tank or not, but the idea being is that you have absolute clarity. There's people there trying to kill you, or you're going to kill them, basically, and then you come home to an environment where those absolutes do not exist at all. Everything is gray, not black and white.
Right, and to compound all of that, I mean, not only have you lost that sort of clarity, but because of the way that the Army uses cycles to get units ready for deployments, when you've come off of a deployment, you go into a bit of a rest and refit, where you're getting all of your equipment fixed, and you're just really slowly building up your training. But it's a time of great boredom for soldiers most of the time.
Right, garrison is definitely harder to live with than being in the field, I would agree.
Absolutely,
yeah.
and as a leader, to try and keep soldiers focused, which helps keep them out of trouble and sort of keep their time occupied in a constructive way. It was very difficult to do.
Sure. Now, are there any couple of individuals that you worked with in the Army that stand out as stories from your platoon or your company where you had guys that experienced roughly the same thing in Iraq, same conditions, same missions, combat situations, yet they had drastically different symptoms or ways of coping?
Yeah, there's one sergeant in particular that comes to mind, and he had been on all three of the exact same tours that I had been on. And in his first tour, he was a dismounted scout with our squadron, so he rode around the back of a Bradley fighting vehicle. And we came home from that deployment. He seemed like he was doing just fine, like everybody else. A little different than before we had gone over, but he was doing fine. And our second tour in 2005, he was doing a lot of patrols in and around Baghdad, and the activity was pretty high in sometimes, and we lost a few soldiers and a couple of leaders. And it seemed to affect him a little more. And I actually left the squadron and went to a brigade headquarters right after we got back, my second tour. And so on our third tour, I had run into him in Kuwait as we were going into Iraq and at a coffee shop, and he was not doing very well. He was having a hard time coping with the fact that he's really trying lady luck here, and the third year in Iraq, and he wasn't too sure he was going to make it, and the amount of stress was making it difficult for him to do his job. Now, I talked to his commander about what had happened. His commander was aware of the situation.
Now, had you ever talked to any of his tank mates, for lack of a better word? What was the perspective of the guy that was sitting next to him in the driver's seat versus what you observed from a command position? Was there a difference in perception on that? Was that sergeant putting on a stoic face for the benefit of the guys that he worked with?
Well, yeah, there's always the element of leaders trying to not show any weakness in front of their soldiers, but at the same time, you're not just worried about yourself as a leader. You have to worry about all of your soldiers. Well, not that soldiers don't worry about their buddy, but that's more of a camaraderie thing as opposed to a very serious responsibility that you have to take care of them, which leads to increased stress on what happens, and also just that stoicism that you have to portray.
Okay. Well, that's I think that's a good spot for me to kind of segue into this a little bit of a wrap up, because we took an extended segment with this time, because it's an important topic. It's important to be able to talk about it from a practical standpoint without getting the sound bites of politicians and policymakers, so that we can understand it from the ground up together in a broad observation in pretty much every case. Every condition as it relates to PTSD, whether it's a symptom of a traumatic brain injury or not, can take months or years to develop, whether you're still in the service or not. And there truly is no standard that can be developed at the onset of looking at ways to mitigate these conditions. But it seems like for many of us, those that stay in the service or those that don't, by being able to stay in touch with those that are like-minded, it can help mitigate these symptoms or possibly even the condition as a whole.
Absolutely. The NCO I was just talking about, that sergeant, he was not going out on mission on his last tour. He was in the headquarters And he's still in the Army today, but he changed jobs so that he's in headquarters. He's feeling useful towards the war efforts, but it's not. He's around soldiers still, and I think that's making a big difference for him. He's doing just well.
For sure. And we'll discuss this a little later in the program also, but for those that are contending with these issues, and Captain Fritz touched on it a little bit, but it helps if you can't call the VA or a veteran service organization, call one of your buddies, visit your neighbor, and do whatever. Just discussing it brings quite a bit of relief to some degree or another. Captain Fritz, excuse me. I want to thank you so much for joining us here. We called you in. You're up over in the D.C. area and consultant for some varying circles of Department of Defense initiatives. And thank you so much for joining us on Veteran Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Great.